All right, here we are looking at another example. This is just a couple of really simple ideas here, just to illustrate a couple of things. One of them was this. Even though you have access to first and second clarinet, first and second bassoon, don't feel like this is a limitation in only using 2 clarinet parts and only using 2 bassoon parts, for example. And don't feel like it's a limitation that if you do write multiple parts, you put them on both of these lines. You certainly can if you want to, but it's not a necessity. So in this first little example here, what I've done is I've loaded up a sustain articulation into the articulations performer. The sustain articulation allows you to play more than one note at the same time, to use polyphony. Which is really nice. It can be a lot faster than trying to split out 2 legato parts over 2 lines when the end result isn't going to be that drastic from, just using the first clarinet for both of them. So it's just another option here. I did the same thing too with the bassoons. I just loaded up a sustain patch in here, key switched it, and so now, oops, here we go. I can get 4 parts out of these 2 instruments. So we're looking at bassoon and just some simple 4-part arranging. Nothing too fancy. You can see here the mod wheel data just giving us a nice little gentle kind of pulse and movement. Now I've also thrown in another MIDI CC data lane here, and that's MIDI CC 22. You can see right there. And the reason why I did that is for this particular harmony, I had the bassoons playing with the clarinets, which is a nice sound, I think. But the default for the bassoon sustain patch is with vibrato. That sounded kind of funny when the clarinets don't have vibrato. By default, CC22 controls the vibrato. And so by changing that, you can hear how it sounded before. We'll put this back down. And it's not a completely displeasing sound, but if we grab these and we push them up, so now if we look, you can see that it's going to switch to without vibrato. Has a much more kind of homogeneous sound where it now sounds like a very mysterious kind of choir, if you will. And so I use that as kind of the basis for this kind of dark flute solo here. I had some strings in there too, but I'll mute those for now. Now that flute kind of sounds a little forward, but when you add the strings to it, you see I just added some real simple strings here. And so what the strings are doing here is we have a little pizzicato in the bass. And then we have a little tremolo in the cello, violas, and second violins. And then the first violins, very lightly, I just have it playing an arco legato to reinforce the melody with the flute. Nothing too fancy. Instead of using the legato on these clarinets and bassoons and splitting that over multiple patches, I didn't necessarily have to do that because the release of these, especially on these longer notes, is satisfactory enough to where I didn't really need to do that. So, I don't have to take up that memory, and I think the sound is pretty pleasing. So what we're looking at in this example It's just a chord, but it's a way to arrange the chord that gives it a really nice, pleasing quality. We're spreading the elements of the chord over the different instruments in their kind of natural scale. So down here, we have the bassoons playing this nice fifth here. Bum, bum. And then right on top of that, we have the clarinets playing this triad, which is directly in order. So we're not crossing anything. We're not skipping over any intervals here. We just have root, fifth, root, third, fifth. And then on top of that, we add the oboes in the very next octave, playing root, third, fifth. And then on top of that, we have the flutes. Then we have just a random note there. Get that out of there. And so we have a very powerful chord because everything's kind of sitting in its own natural scale, and we cover a lot of kind of harmonic space there. Let's check out this next example here. So in this example, we have a trumpet playing a root in a third here. This is an E major chord. And then to help fill that out, we're using some other instruments. We're using oboe and flutes. And we're using clarinet. If we look at just the clarinet and the trumpet, you can see that between these two instruments, we're making a triad. We have the trumpet, bum, bum, and then the clarinet sits right on top of there. And so by kind of blending these together, we can get new colors. I mean, that's a lot of what orchestration is all about, is using the instruments to paint with colors and paint with textures in an audible way. And so if we just leave the clarinet and the trumpet, we're getting a different sound than if we had three trumpets playing bum, 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 because that would have a real brassy sound. So that one clarinet note in there helps to just soften everything out. And then to give it a little bit more power and kind of give it some more texture, we can add these oboes in there and these flutes to get this. And it's a very delicate thing to balance brass and woodwinds. I mean, one of the reasons why the brass sits in the back of the orchestra is because they're so loud. And so if you're kind of matching up things, you may need two woodwind players to match the volume of tone that you get from one brass player. So there's some different things to think about in there. So we can kind of change things around here. We get rid of this, and so now we're going to hear the clarinets playing a B and an oboe playing a B as well to fill out the two horn notes. So basically we're hearing four instrumentalists, but even though this is a trumpet solo, you get the idea. There's two notes. It's basically like having two trumpets play at the same time. And that kind of spreads the tone because oboes work pretty well blending with trumpets because they both have a kind of nasally tone. Or we could move this down and have two clarinets play it. So now two clarinets are playing Bs, which sounds a little bit different than one clarinet and one oboe. Right? Because we have one trumpet playing an E, another one playing a G sharp. But to match one of those notes, we're going to need at least two woodwind players playing at about the same dynamic level. Or we just have them play at a dynamic level that's a little bit louder. So if we were to have them play at a mezzo forte or a mezzo medium, kind of right in the middle of the range here, mezzo forte I think is probably where that is. Now we may not need this oboe. So the trumpets here, and this is not exact, you can see the mod wheels all the way down, so that's going to be their lowest dynamic, but this is Cinebrass, and Cinebrass is a pretty loud library. But you can hear how bumping that up to make the clarinet a mezzo forte now kind of fills that out a little bit better. So just a little example there. Another example that shows blending instruments is this right here. I have two horns. This is horn solo. So I have just these two notes here. And then inside of that octave, we have bassoon. The horns are kind of used to blend woodwinds and brass together, and the bassoons blend very well with them. So the bassoons are playing F sharp and A, so we're making a D major chord here. And check this out. If you didn't know better, if I didn't just tell you, you would almost think that that was four horns because they blend very, very well. And you can see that this is just making a nice close harmony. We have D, F sharp, A, D. We could also go further because the horns are not playing with any vibrato. We could make the bassoons not play with any vibrato. They blend very, very well. And a good way to do that is using a harmony writing technique called enclosure. So we have the horns here, the French horns, in an octave, and then we put the bassoons right in the middle. So the horns are kind of enclosing where the bassoons live, which kind of hides the texture. If we were to move this around here, so now we have the horns playing D and F sharp, and the bassoons playing A and D. It still blends pretty nicely, but I think that it blends even nicer like this. Because I think your ear tends to gravitate towards the highest thing. So you're kind of focusing in on the tonality of the horns, but kind of hiding those bassoons right in there. So it's pretty cool. In this last example, we are blending trumpet, and this is just a single trumpet line. With some woodwinds. And here we have two oboes. So two oboes and the trumpet. When you combine woodwinds and brass, the effect is that you are creating a new texture, but you're also softening the brass sound. You're kind of mellowing it out. It's not as pure of a brass sound. And like we talked about before, you do need more support when you're putting woodwinds up against brass because woodwinds aren't nearly as loud as brass instruments. So at least kind of two players for the one soloist if they're around the same dynamic. And again, we can push the levels and the dynamics to change that, but we can do the same example with two clarinets. Which gives it a nice support, and it definitely mellows the sound down, because now we're hearing a lot of the mellow textures here of the clarinet. But if we combine that with the oboe, we get an entirely new texture. I tried to balance this example to show you there's a lot of subtleties in here to creating sound, because you can just barely hear the oboe's kind of duck quack sound come out. The oboes are playing at a slightly louder dynamic. The trumpet is playing at its lowest dynamic, which in Cinebrass is still pretty loud. So to get a better balance, we could actually go in here and we could knock this down maybe a little bit more, or we could use CC11. So we could jump up here, go to CC11, and we could just put this down just a hair. The only trick that I've found with using CC11 is, at least in my experience, is once you mess with CC11, you have to constantly adjust it, which can be a little bit annoying. So by default, if you don't touch CC11, it always remains at 100%. As soon as you touch it though, if you go to record a new MIDI clip down the road, like if we put this at 0, right at the end here, and then we record enable this, we don't have anything. Mod wheels all the way up, nothing. But as soon as we push up MIDI CC11, we have it again. So it's like two things that you need to mess around with. That can be a little bit annoying. Now there's several workarounds that you can do, but when you're kind of intermixing these with other instruments, you really have to keep in mind that, a brass instrument in real life, not in sample world, is going to be quite a bit louder than a woodwind instrument at a ratio of around 2-to-1, depending, give or take. So it's just something to keep in mind there. You either adjust the dynamics of something that doesn't have a great dynamic range, like Cinebrass. They recorded different dynamic levels, but they normalized the sample so that the difference between piano and forte, not really that much. So you may have to do some kind of dynamic management there within the actual levels, and you can do that with MIDI CC11, or you can do some other programming, or you can even come in here and adjust it and use automation here inside the DAW if you're using an audio return channel or on whatever channel it's coming back on. So, we can adjust the levels like this by pulling them back and automating them that way, if that's the way it works. And the same thing within the woodwinds. We have to pick the appropriate dynamics so that we're getting the right tone, but also so that it matches the other instruments in a way that makes sense. And then on top of that, we have to manage the overall kind of levels between the other instruments and the other sample libraries. So it sounds really complex, but I think once you get into it and you start to work with the different libraries, there's a lot of things that you need to consider in kind of level management. But you have to work with the tools that you have. So hopefully those ideas will help you be able to better manipulate the stuff that you already have and give you a better idea of how to blend the dynamics and the levels to make things sound the way that you'd like them to sound, and natural and realistic too. So we're going to look at more of these ideas coming up in the next few examples as we look at more pieces of music, and we're combining more instruments and creating more colors and textures. So check that out.